Hi, I'd like to talk about a BIP that was introduced to Bitcoin, the Bitcoin Core repo, that seeks to temporarily reduce the amount of arbitrary data getting stored in the Bitcoin blockchain. And I support it. It's tentatively named BIP 444. That already became a point of contention, just the sheer naming of it. If that can that's already become like people dying on the hill of that issue, which tells you how heated this is. Normally, no one would really care that much about what number a BIP gets. Anyway, the BIP is not written by me. It's not written by Luke. It is based on something Luke wrote before, but it's done at the whim of the person that wrote the BIP. He's called Dathan Ohm. I have spoken to him. He is not anything to do with Ocean. I have worked with him on it, but he is doing it of his own volition. He is nothing to do with Ocean. I need to keep repeating that because a lot of the personal attacks seek to just make this about Ocean and therefore contaminate it. Not that I believe Ocean should be a contaminating name to be associated with anything, but people do like to attack ideas and not people. And they need a person. And in this case, the people that work for Ocean are people, so they will attack them. I wouldn't normally have brought that up, but it's Greg making those attacks, and he's such a significant voice that it always has to be addressed. The fact that Greg doesn't have proper arguments and instead is pushing back based on who the people are, even though those people aren't the people that wrote the BIP, tells you the kind of dirtiness we're dealing with in this fight. So the BIP works for 1 year. At the moment, it's unknown exactly when it would kick in, the fork, but it would limit op return at the consensus level, along with a bunch of stuff enabled by SegWit and Taproot, making it so that all known ways of stashing data inside Bitcoin are impossible. Not only will they not be relayed around the network in mempools, they also, if they were to be put inside a block, would be the cause of that block getting rejected. So it's not just a soft limiting like policy is. This is a hard limiting. It's not going to allow this stuff in blocks at all. You will see 0 op returns bigger than 83 bytes should this thing happen. I am fine to do this. Nothing I have used Bitcoin for, and none of the legitimate use cases for Bitcoin, for the most part, need to take advantage of Bitcoin being able to trivially store blobs of arbitrary data. Now, people are going to push back on that, and I will address that because I'm going to get into the FUD against this in this video, but I'm just going to focus on why I'm in favor of it for now. And it will become clear why my potential for withdrawing my support for it only concerns issues that I believe have been countered and addressed. So the motivation for it comes as a result of Core 30. I was happy fighting about mempool policy and seeing people run sensible nodes with sensible policies and NOTS adoption increasing and increasing. I was happy seeing that. NOTS adoption did somewhat plateau around 21% of the network. Very legitimately, I get extremely annoyed with allegations of that being fake or astroturfed. Everywhere I go around the world, I've had this corroborated to me that there are just thousands of Bitcoiners out there that don't like what Core are doing and want there to be less arbitrary data in Bitcoin. And this was corroborated to me, with an audience very loudly clapping and, not letting I was on a panel in Switzerland, with me and Luke against Lamerson and Peter Toad, and the audience just basically wouldn't let them speak at one point. I just said something very basic about node runners not having an incentive to want to take on the additional burden of storing all the world's most horrible arbitrary data. It's not money. And there was like a long clap for it. And, and it became clear that the devs are in their own bubble. If they really do think that no one's running knots and it's just me and Luke and we whipped up a bunch of plebs into hysterical overreaction about something unimportant, that's not true. This thing has been going on for a long time now, and more people are agreeing. So I do get annoyed with that. I'm not in a bubble. I am in a bit of an echo chamber because naturally some people just become abusive and I block them and don't want to interact with them anymore. But I'm trying to leave open avenues to people that disagree with me where, tolerable. Whereas the devs are completely just closing doors and, operating inside their own silent echo chamber and just insulting people that disagree with them, saying they're not technical. And, so that's roughly what's going on here. BIP 444, probably named that. I don't know what number it will ultimately get. I don't really care. And it like I said, it limits a bunch of stuff. It basically fixes Taproot and limits op return at the consensus level. It's in response to Core 30, because Core 30, while it didn't change anything about Taproot, it definitely did change something material about op return. Big op returns are now going to be a thing because of that change. You can argue that they didn't change Bitcoin. They only changed the way Core works, but that's a lie by omission about what happens with their defaults. So the reality is them changing a default and making it 1,000 times bigger has a material result in how Bitcoin looks. And we're feeling the result of that now. People are already putting big op returns that wouldn't have been possible before in the chain. Like someone made an AI-generated porn video of one of the core developers and uploaded it into the chain. And it was a Mara block that mined it. I maintain that if they'd have submitted that via Slipstream, Mara wouldn't have put it in the chain. But now that it's ubiquitous and all over the network, because thousands of people are running Core 30, now they don't consider themselves liable for it anymore. It's the Bitcoin network that did that. It's not a miner. So that is why the whole thing has been escalated. And this op returns of giant sizes are just not helpful in Bitcoin. The fact that we limited it before with policy, which is not watertight, was good enough. But the fact that the policy is gone now just exposes a horrible thing that's possible in Bitcoin's consensus. Giant op returns, you're allowed a whole megabyte if you want, are not useful to Bitcoin in any way. And the fact that someone would have to pay to put it in a block, by virtue of either paying a miner to put it in or having to mine it yourself, that doesn't protect us from what can be done with those giant op returns. They are there, they are ripe for being used as an effort to sabotage Bitcoin by making node runners have to host horrible content on their computers forever that they can't delete. And I'm not up for that, and I've explained why ad nauseum. And so it makes sense to tighten that consensus rule and to stop from Bitcoin from allowing that. And that's what the BIP does, in addition with, as I said, putting a bunch of guardrails on Taproot. So in comes the FUD. Hopefully I've explained why I want it. I should explain, before I go into the FUD, why I think it will be a success. No one wants to get on board the losing team, right? So they're going to say, we're just losing, it's a bluff. But I've been here before with the same group of people in a very similar scenario, with all the big wigs in the industry saying, this is silly, you're not going to do it, and then them all capitulating last minute. I think it's going to be the same here. We have way more nodes running knots than we did running the UASF client back in 2017. So if anything, we're starting from a much stronger position with community support, but we are starting from a weaker position with regard to industry support. There were a lot of people in the industry that did support BIP 148. Most of them didn't, but there were some significant players that did. Right now, we have basically zero institutional support, which is concerning, but the thing only just came around 5 minutes ago. We do have way more support amongst the plebs, and they are the people to whom Bitcoin belongs. And I would defy anyone to disagree with me. If you run the nodes, you are the network. That's all there is to it. And if they are in favor of limiting arbitrary data, then they will get their way. And if you go to war with them, they have nothing to lose, because the only thing that matters to them is their stash. They don't care about all the other stuff. So that's why I want it. I believe it will be a success. I've seen all this happen before. I don't believe any of the resistance against it will have the competence to pull off any sort of counter fork. I think they will talk about it and hashtag about it, but I don't believe they're actually capable of doing it. As far as I can tell, Luke is, the 13th most prolific contributor to Bitcoin. But more importantly, he knows the code base better than anyone else, which is why I trust him with writing the fork. By maintaining knots, which is a fork of core, he has to know every single line that goes into core in order to put it in knots. Everyone else, because they don't do that, they might be a very strong contributor to Bitcoin Core, but they stay within their area of the code base, what they're interested in. Are they interested in mempool? Are they interested in consensus stuff? Whereas Luke has to deal with all of it and rebase it all. So he knows that code better than anyone else, in my estimation. And other people that might want to oppose the fork can stop themselves from getting wiped out, and I'll explain wipeout and all that stuff. Let me just make a note so I don't forget to come back to that. So let's get into the FUD. First off, the personal attack FUD, which is, isn't this ocean? Luke is bad for whatever reason. This is significant FUD. It's the most bad faith, because obviously this is, a logical fallacy to attack the people making the argument or proposal. And in this case, it's doubly wrong because we're not the one making the proposal. I grant you that we are very close to it, and obviously I'm Ocean and Luke is Ocean, and we're both like a part of this. But Dathan is not. Dathan is someone I know who I've spoken to, and he wrote the fork, he wrote the BIP, and he is the champion of it. He took something Luke wrote and he made it his own, and he did stuff that I know was not Luke's preference for how we did it. And I should make a note of the two different scenarios there and how he flipped them. I'll get into that later. Just technicalities of how the fork's going to work. He's not Ocean, and he was a NIM deliberately, because if he wasn't a NIM, not only does it carry personal risk and personal attacks, but people would just refuse to debate the idea. They would just attack the person instead. And in lieu of that, the fact that Greg can't attack the person because he doesn't know who he is, he attacks Ocean instead, and because we're kind of associated with it. Again, it's still the same fallacy. It just looks even more stupid because we didn't write the bit. And Dathan is not a mere puppet. He has his own opinions on how this thing works. I made suggestions for how he should change the stuff, and as far as I know, those are being ignored. So there you go. Attacking the people and not the idea is a way of saying you don't have a real reason to push back against it. And it should look like that to anyone prepared to do their analysis. And further, it embarrasses Core because Greg saying Ocean is suing people or coercing miners, his implication or direct slander in that regard being untrue, that should have been taken down according to the GitHub moderation policies of Bitcoin Core. But it wasn't, because we all know those policies are nonsense. When me and Marcellus got kicked off of the other pull request that made Op return huge, we were told, you're making personal attacks, get out of here. Our personal attacks were relevant. They weren't even personal attacks. All we said was, hey, Lamerson Job is affiliated with Citria. He's an investor in Citria. That's a conflict of interest because they benefit from this change. That should be stated here. We got banned from GitHub for saying that. Whereas Greg can say Ocean is suing people that won't run this fork. They are coercing miners. That's not true. Our claim was true, and we got kicked off for it being off topic and, personal attack, not a technical discussion. Greg can do it, and it's not even true when he does it. And not only does he not get his comment, marked as off topic, he doesn't get banned from GitHub either. And to add further insult to injury, the pushback against what he said, the correction of it, that got marked as off topic. So it's just hypocrisy all around. Very annoying for Core to be doing things like that. That's the personal attack stuff. Obviously, the dumbest of the three pushback things that we've gotten. The other two are much more technical, but I thought I'd address it first because it comes from Greg. And if Greg says jump, 90% of the developers in the space say how high. It's pathetic, but that it makes it so significant that it can't go unaddressed. Greg has been a spout of defamatory, inaccurate libel for months now in this debate, and people still tolerate him, and I have no idea why. He's utterly burnt any goodwill or reputation that he's built for himself. People say it takes a lifetime to build a reputation and 1 minute to destroy it. I wish that was true. Actually, some people can act disgracefully for a long time, and people are very hesitant to abandon the respect they once had for them. So anyway, that's the personal attack stuff. Then there's the confiscation FUD. That's FUD number 2. So be ready for these 3 things because they're going to come. You're going to get personally attacked if you support this stuff. You are too. Not just me and Luke and Dathan. But number 2 is the confiscation FUD. There are conditions in which people can encumber their UTXOs that would make them unspendable should this soft fork happen. That has been addressed, and in the second draft of the BIP, there will be a block height check that makes it so that if you have UTXOs encumbered with those conditions, they get grandfathered in. So no one is getting their coins confiscated. It was a concern initially, though it's an overblown concern initially. Now it's not a concern at all. I'm reiterating this because I can't rely on the good faith of people arguing against us here to drop that argument. Even though that argument is no longer valid, they're going to keep saying this fork will confiscate people's coins. It won't. There are edge cases where you have the ability for it to confiscate coins, but those apply to any soft fork ever. And you can sabotage any soft fork by encumbering UTXOs with conditions that exist within predefined spaces for future forks. So if I find out, for example, that you want to activate CTV and an activation client comes along for it that starts in March of next year, I can dump a bunch of my UTXOs in the space that will become restricted by the activation of CTV in a way that makes them permanently unspendable once CTV activates. And that is not Bitcoin Network's problem. That's me being a jerk and trying to get in the way of the network improving itself. And I don't tolerate that at all. If I state my intention to drive a car from that coordinate to that coordinate at some future date, and you find out about it and you dump a bunch of your personal belongings in that route and then complain that I can't do it because I will damage your stuff, you suck. You are being an annoying and antisocial person, and I'm not accepting that as my responsibility when that happens. There's not a great analogy, of course, but the fact that when this BIP came out, a bunch of people started putting their UTXOs in that space makes me go, I don't care. If you want to play stupid games, you can win stupid prizes. And I don't credit them as having put a lot of Bitcoins in there because they're not that silly. But they are trying to set a precedent that I think they haven't thought about. I can sabotage any future soft fork in Bitcoin by encumbering UTXOs with conditions that would get rendered unspendable permanently should those soft forks happen. And the Bitcoin network can't become impotent because of that and unable to soft fork. This is trolling, and people can lose money trolling if they want. No Bitcoiner I have ever met is encumbering coins with the kind of conditions that would have rendered them unspendable should this fork happen in its first iteration. Now that there's the grandfathering, it's completely neutralized. So I'm hoping you can consider this rebutted or this rebuttal completely sound. There is no risk of confiscation. It's just FUD. They are going to keep throwing this over and over and over again, and you're just going to have to say, this is BS. I'm not falling for this. It takes me far too long to reach this level of fatigue with bad arguments. Throughout the last 2 years, I always start out assuming good faith, and then slowly over the months of rehashing the arguments over and over again, I get less and less tolerant of bad ideas. I need to start and hit the ground running with this whole fork thing, because people are going to make bad arguments. I'm going to treat them as though they're making them in good faith, and I'm not going to hit them on their head like I need to. I need to say this unequivocally from the start. There is no risk of confiscation with this soft fork that doesn't exist with all other potential soft forks. I.e., it's not going to happen unless you deliberately put yourself in harm's way. You know the fork is coming. If you want to, after the fork, encumber your UTXOs with some nums only, non-key path redeemable tap script with a depth of over 7 leafs, or whatever layers, whatever you refer to the layers as in Taproot. If you want to do that and make your coins unspendable, go ahead. But there isn't a wallet out there that can construct a transaction for you like that anyway, because it's crazy experimental. You'd have to be deliberately sabotaging yourself there. And if you're going to do that, you don't get to blame other people for what happens as a result. Confiscation FUD, done. Not having it, and they're going to throw that constantly. Scaling FUD is the last one. So it's not all just arbitrary data, right? Some arbitrary data is there to complement scaling techniques and monetary uses of Bitcoin, namely things like coin joins and Lightning and BitVM and and multi-sig, stuff like that. Sophisticated things we can do with programmable money that might require a bit of arbitrary data. Well, here's the thing. It never requires it. It's always just lazy devs. Now, I am out of my depth in making the kind of rebuttal I just made to the confiscation FUD. I can't speak so authoritatively on the scaling FUD because I am out of my depth on it. But as far as I can tell, we have a few case studies where people want the ability to store arbitrary data along with their UTXOs for their own convenience at the expense of the general network, where we got to say to them, you're just ignorant and lazy, and you could have done this way better without encumbering nodes with your arbitrary data. Examples, multisig. You have bare multisig, which is a super old way of doing it. No one does multisig that way. And when you did do it that way, it basically meant it was everyone else's problem to store your quorum or other elements of how you would redeem, how you would meet the conditions of spending from your multisig address. Because in multisig you have certain conditions, right? It can be the order of how you sign things, like it's got to be the cold card, then the Trezor, then the other cold card, or something like that. And if you get the order wrong, that messes stuff up. And there's derivation path information and stuff like that. And you store that stuff locally. That is on you to do. It's not on the network to store a backup of that. So you have stateless backups for your multisig. Bare multisig did the latter, but no one uses it like that. We have better multisig that doesn't work that way anymore. Next example, CoinJoin. There was 3 well-known implementations of CoinJoins: Samurai, Wasabi Wallet, and Join Market. Wasabi Wallet and Join Market did not make use of storing arbitrary data on-chain. They did it without needing that. So are we degrading privacy by removing arbitrary data storage as a convenient option for people trying to add privacy to Bitcoin via CoinJoins? Well, it turns out that 2 of the better implementations didn't require that. One of them did, and it was, people know my gripe against Samurai. I've always had an issue with them. They stored 45 bytes, I think it was, of op return stuff, and this caused a whole rift with Ocean when we launched because they characterized us as attacking them when we'd had 42 bytes in knots since 4 years before they even existed, and that code never changed. But anyway, they stored a bunch of metadata about CoinJoins, which is a bad idea. And, they've since been, shut down. And all that metadata is now disadvantageous because they confiscated Samurai's server, which had presumably a bunch of information, people's XPubs, which undoes a bunch of the coin joining. Is a disaster. That was the worst privacy, the worst CoinJoin implementation there was out there. And part of that was a result of the fact that they stored this data on-chain for people to use to unravel stuff later on. And our encouragement, being the kind of people advocating for a fork that limits arbitrary data, getting pushback from people saying, well, what about things we can do in Bitcoin like privacy? And us saying to them, do it properly, stop encumbering nodes with arbitrary data. We've generally been right to say that. At least we were with multisig and we were with CoinJoins. And what else is there? Lightning and BitVM. Those are the other 2 examples. Lightning, these devs really want to scale Lightning and bring about LN symmetry by reducing the need for nodes to store all prior states of a channel, that they would need in case there was a justice type scenario where someone's trying to close a channel in an old state. They've wanted that for ages, and they want to do it by stashing data in the chain. And again, the pushback is do it properly. Make people store that stuff locally. Don't make them store it don't rely on everyone else storing that data for you. Your backups don't belong on other people's computers. Is it a nice to have? Sure. But does it undermine Bitcoin's ability to scale? Having everyone running a node, it does. And that's more important. So Lightning devs can do this stuff properly. As I said, I am a little out of my depth talking about scaling FUD. So I'm giving you higher level principles here. The general principle is if you want to do interesting stuff on Bitcoin that can help scale the monetary use case, then understood and appreciated, but please do it in a way that doesn't require storing blobs of data that's irrelevant to everyone except you on their computers, because it's counter to the incentives we want to create. We want to incentivize people to run nodes. We don't want to say, hey, you have to keep storing people's multisig backups, and you have to keep storing their whatever it is they need to close their Lightning channels without needing prior states. We don't want to keep adding that burden onto nodes, and there's usually a way for developers to work around it anyway. And there's client-side verification or validation of some privacy technique that happens within BitVM. I mean, this fork kills BitVM, and that is a scaling tool. So that is the most effective piece of FUD to push back against this that there is. But it's also going to garner the least amount of sympathy from people that might support this fork, because it's just a bunch of devs wanting to play around and tell us that they're helping scale Bitcoin. But really, as I said, they're in their own echo chamber. But worse than that, they're unwilling to come out of it, and they're complaining about how Bitcoin works because it's frustrating for them. Was it Russell O'Connor complaining recently about Bitcoin's boring? It's not a complete programming language. It's so frustrating that I can't do these things I want to do. You know, great script restoration. Let's just add features. I want Bitcoin to be able to do more stuff. This is really just counter to what Bitcoin is. It needs to be left alone, and it doesn't need development. It needs maintenance. And these are very different concepts. And devs just need to grow up and deal with the fact that doing that stuff is quite boring, and adding all this sexy new tools to it it's just pure crypto, man. Bitcoin is going to issue all that stuff as it should. But yeah, the scaling FUD, like I said, it is the most legitimate pushback, but it's outright in there in the BIP. Does this kill BitVM for a year? Yeah, it kills BitVM for a year. But again, is any Bitcoiner I know going to be like, no, you can't get in the way of BitVM? Because I don't know any Bitcoiners that are stoked about BitVM. All I know is developers that are stoked about it, and their incentives don't line up the same way that hodlers do. Hodlers just want you to not to mess around with their money, and they don't want you to degrade the entire ecosystem by filling it up with objectionable data. They're going to protect themselves from stuff like that, and that's what this BIP does. So those are the pushbacks you're going to get. So just to reiterate them, you have personal attacks, which is going to be the most draining of the lot. It's the least valid, it's the most effective, it's what they're going to run with. You have the confiscation FUD, which I don't know if we can counter that squarely and articulately. They might just stop doing it. Same as the fee estimation stuff about filters. They just gave up with that argument eventually because we kept countering it too effectively. Then you have the scaling FUD, which, as I said, is the most legitimate pushback, but at the same time is going to garner the least amount of sympathy because no one really believes in all these magical scaling solutions that can be added to Bitcoin. No one sees the desire for it because you can get transactions in on L1 so cheap at the moment, so there's no imminent need for it, all this scaling tech. And second off, we've had scaling tech, and it's always a bitter disappointment versus what it is we're sold. So Taproot is everyone's favorite thing to bash now because we've seen how bad it was in comparison to what we were promised. Taproot still is promising, but it's been, almost 5 years now. And, we're starting to see some use cases, and I am still excited about those use cases. But I'm only going to allow myself to get optimistic about scaling tech if we can put some guardrails on Taproot and fix what it broke. And that's what this does. So this fork really, I'm going to characterize it as doing two things. Fixes op return, which has no reason to be massive, at consensus level. There's no reason for 1 megabyte op returns to be a thing in Bitcoin. That's just a mistake. It is an ancient mistake that we can just fix now. We obscured the mistake in consensus by having very effective spam filters that stopped it from rearing its ugly head. But those are gone, so now we have to fix it. That is why it's imminent. That's why we have to do this fork, and that's why Core 30 is responsible. This is a reaction to Core 30. It's not something we could have justified a long time ago. And that's going to be another source of FUD, actually. So I'll add that as number 4. Why didn't you guys propose this fork ages ago? Why are you only doing it now? Why did you spend 2 years talking about spam filters and now you're talking about consensus? Because Core 30 happened. Core 30 changed the game. It made it so that something that's consensus possible that wasn't generally happening is now something we can expect to happen all the time and is already happening. Now there is AI-generated porn of developers inside my hard drive, and it's going to be there forever. Even if I prune, it's not going to get out of the pruned section for weeks, depending on how aggressively I try to prune, and then I can't run an Electrum server and my wallet won't work anymore. So this is a non-starter. I don't want that on my computer, and that's there now. And it's in the blockchain forever. And to make matters worse, it's probably someone on my side that did that. Someone did that vindictively because they're annoyed with the core developers. So they're going to say, all right, you want porn in the chain, do you? All right, well, we're gonna make AI generated porn of you and stick it in there, see how you like it. I do not support people doing that at all. I don't think it's necessary for us to force the issue by demonstrating the harm core have done by doing stuff like that. And it sucks that I now have that on my computer. I wish it hadn't happened. I have no desire to be telling people I told you so. So with all that, actually, no, let me address that last piece of FUD, because that's something that they're going to push back on a lot. It escapes me for now, so I'm just going to move on to the next topic. Wipeout risk, asymmetry. How do soft forks work in general? Can we win this as a minority? These are very interesting things. Now, I'll point to the prior soft fork, SegWit. Right. Obviously we soft forked in Taproot and stuff like that, but I'm talking about a UASF, like the one that was the same team of people, Luke, a BIP being out there, BIP 148, and a bunch of the industry saying, this is ridiculous, you're never going to win. Jihan Wu famously said, I just read BIP 148, looks stupid. And Luke said, that stupid BIP is going to activate SegWit whether you like it or not. And it did. But people didn't think we would win, and there were 500 of us at the time running, UASF nodes eventually, and then someone spun up another 500 to make it look like garbage, or to posture naively, thinking people would fall for that. Obviously, just VPS nodes, not really meaningful. So we won in the end. There was a bit of a political move made with BIP 91 where we said, all right, miners aren't going to run UASF. What if they run something else that's called something else? And then they ran that instead, and that was BIP 91 instead of BIP 148. And then everyone, came together, and the network was happy and internally congruent, and we were having SegWit. And at the same time, Bcash forked itself off, and that was the big block hard fork, and that was them saying goodbye. Can a similar thing happen here? Well, there are two activation mechanisms laid out. And this is why you know it's not Luke, because Luke had the preference the opposite way around. That would be a pretty sophisticated psyop if Luke, deliberately wrote the BIP in a way that he disagreed with initially, and then on GitHub made it something he agreed with. No, it's just genuinely he disagrees. So there's the reactive case and there's the proactive case for this entire architecture that's been laid out for how we're going to reduce arbitrary data. The proactive case is what I prefer. That's what the BIP does. It's not what Luke originally laid out. And it says, beginning in a few months, these are the new consensus rules. If you mine a block with an op return 84 bytes or larger, it's an invalid block. No longer is it you just got around the mempool policies. It's straight up you broke the rules of Bitcoin and it's over. Your block is now a garbage. That is, lose my train of thought. That is so we're talking about the proactive case. We're assuming that nothing has made it into the chain that is so bad that we need to go and rewrite history, right? Because no one wants to do that. It's horrible. It sets an awful precedent. It's happened in Bitcoin's past before, but when the network was relatively tiny, so it was much more forgivable back then and bugs were more expected. This isn't really a bug. This is straight up bad design now that we're having to, have a civil war about whether it's appropriate to fix it or not. I mean, I would characterize giant op returns as a bug, but not everyone's going to do that. Some people seem incapable of acknowledging bugs now. They just think Bitcoin is perfect, and if you change it, you're a tyrant. And this is very, very annoying because it's so naive. They're basically saying Bitcoin cannot have bugs. But anyway, the proactive case says, let's assume no one maliciously attacks the chain and puts a bunch of stuff in there that's going to make people not want to run nodes anymore. And hopefully we just make it by the skin of our teeth the next few months, and then we activate a bunch of hard rules that make it so that that stuff just can't make it in anymore. Everyone's happy. We live happily ever after. Then for a year, those rules remain in place, and maybe they get extended, or maybe they don't. It's the reason it's temporary, and I should touch on that too, is because we are changing consensus rules and making them a lot tighter, and that's a terrifying thing to do from the perspective of not breaking stuff now, but wanting to do things in the future that we would then have to hard fork to enable again. We don't want that to be the case. So if we temporarily limit a bunch of stuff at consensus, and it turns out we limited something that was really useful for some use case that's, congruent with money and all that stuff, and now we can't do it, well, we only have to wait a few months before the rules loosen again. So that's why temporary was chosen. It should be far less controversial, because if you really hate some rule that we're doing here, oh well, it's 12 months of that rule. Now, Zenda already made the joke, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary soft fork, because it can be extended. Sure, maybe we do that, but we are not a government and this is not a bureaucracy. I would like to think, and I genuinely do think, that if we are limiting a bunch of stuff that we really need to enable again in Bitcoin with this temporary soft fork, that we are going to modify at least what we continue at the end of the 12-month period. So it would be like February 2027 when everything becomes possible again. And we might just say, okay, well, we'll keep the op return small. We'll keep op if disabled within Taproot, and a few other things like that. But this thing needs to be in there. Or maybe we just need op return at 144 bytes or something like that. We can do stuff like that. And we can even loosen the consensus again, but have policy that stays exactly where that is, so that it basically gets respected again. And we revive the use of policy to keep things sensible at the P2P layer, and minimize and discourage the use of things that go outside those by virtue of that, whilst not limiting what Bitcoin can do in consensus, where it's too clunky to move around quickly. So that's why it's temporary, and I hope that's a good explanation of why we've done that, instead of make it permanent right off the bat. And if it does become permanent, some subset of the rules can be what ultimately becomes permanent rather than all of it. At the moment, for convenience and simplicity of code, op return is included in the restrictions that are temporary rather than permanent. Some people said, why don't you just make op return permanent and do all the Taproot guardrails temporarily? And Luke said, well, that just makes the code more complicated and it's not particularly necessary. And I agree with keeping things as simple as possible for now. That's not a deal breaker for me. I do think op return can be limited at the consensus level for the rest of time, and I have no problem with that. I only see it as a tool for harm beyond a couple hundred bytes at absolute max. So getting back to the asymmetry of it, what happens if a whole bunch of people are running nodes that enforce these new rules and we hit the fork height where these new rules come into effect? Instantly you're at a biting point. You're a fork in the road, literally, where people have to decide what they're going to do. So, but here's the asymmetrical risk of it. Assuming we just naively go into this and everyone leaves their core 30 and below nodes running as normal, and their NOTs nodes running as normal, and there's this UASF node that enforces a new rule that said, okay, starting at block 950,000 or whatever it is we're at that point, 950,001, if it has an op return bigger than 83 bytes, or if it has a taproot that contains an op if, or any of the conditions we don't allow, that block is invalid and we throw it away. The UASF nodes, if the rest of the network is not enforcing their rules, the rest of the network will have a blockchain that gets longer and carries on as normal, assuming they retain 100% of the hash power, while the UASF nodes sit. Their chain doesn't progress at all. And nothing can happen on that chain. But there's no risk to anything. The UTXOs are frozen. If you spend them, they just sit in the mempools of other UASF nodes, and actually the other nodes here as well. But they never get confirmed in a chain because no one's mining on that chain. That's one of the deadest scenarios possible for this fork. You have nodes, but those are relatively cheap to spin up. They're not as powerful as people mining blocks. So now let's talk about a scenario where 10% of the hash rate is on the UASF side. Then what happens is, when you hit that fork height, 90% of the network's still mining the old rules. So in the time that they mine 9 blocks, the UASF chain gets 1 block. Then 18 blocks on this other one, then 2 blocks, assuming average luck. Now that's a scenario where the UASF chain probably just wins, without assuming other things happening. I'll get into those in a bit. Now, how can that be? How can a chain with only 10% of the hash rate ultimately win the one with 90% of the hash rate? Because if it's the other way around ever, the incumbent chain, by having a more permissive rule set than the UASF chain, always risks being wiped out. And all of the nodes accept the longest valid proof of work. But the UASF nodes have a stricter set of requirements about what constitutes valid proof of work. Now, I'm trying to put this in a way that's not going to just confuse everyone. The risk there is asymmetric. If our UASF chain ever gets more cumulative proof of work than theirs, it wipes out everything that happened on their chain from the fork height all the way up to where we eventually got to when we exceeded their total proof of work. The reverse isn't true. So the UASF chain can sit there going, it might take me, it might be 12 hours before we find a block. Oh, we found one. Now I have to wait another 12 hours before we find a block. And you do that until you've gone through one difficulty period, which will take forever. It will take months, and then the difficulty drops, but only 25%. And then it's, 8 hours until you find a block. And what's the price of the coins on that chain? Who knows? Who knows if there's even going to be a market for it? Because that market is very difficult to make persist. Because this is not a hard fork. This is not like Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin, where you have two separate networks that can never recombine into one. That can't happen here. Eventually, if there's any sort of movement or life on the UASF chain, the chain that tries to ignore it has an existential threat. Because if the UASF chain ever gets long enough, it will wipe out the other chain. And that's because we are doing stuff that's entirely valid according to all them. They don't mind if none of our blocks contain op returns bigger than 83 bytes, and all of our op returns that are smaller than 83 bytes fit within their rules. The only reason they're not following our blockchain is because we don't have as much proof of work. We've just fallen behind them, but everything we're doing is valid on their chain. Everything they're doing on their chain is not valid on ours, so we will keep rejecting them. Everything they do is irrelevant to us. All they're doing is spinning up a fake chain that doesn't abide by our rules, that if we ever exceed in cumulative proof of work, we'll just wipe it out with our entire alternate version of history. And in order to combat that, well, this is the asymmetric risk, right? So you get into prisoner's dilemma type scenarios very quickly there. The 90% incumbent chain, if any of them defect over to the UASF chain, which the sooner they do and the first one to do it loses less of their, their history, any blocks they've mined, they don't lose them, or they minimize losses if they're the first one to jump ship onto UASF. The fact that incentive there exists means it makes sense for a torrent of hash rate to flood over from the non-forked chain to the UASF chain. Because if they're the last one to do it, they're the last one to find a block on that chain, which is going to get wiped out the minute the UASF chain exceeds it. Then all they're doing is throwing electricity in the garbage. Maybe they can sell their Bitcoins immediately on an exchange and try and keep it, but I don't think they want to be in that scenario. They want to mine coins that aren't going to get erased from history. So that's the asymmetric risk. It's a little naive and a little simplified because there are retaliatory measures, right? So people can use activity from one chain or the other to contaminate their UTXOs, or at least contaminate a transaction they create that combines a UTXO that's spendable on both with a UTXO that only exists on one of them. This is kind of hard to explain, but it's what we had to do with BSV and BCH when we were dumping the two versions of Bcash. When Craig Wright forked off Bcash, they didn't do replay protection, which meant that if you spent on one chain, you could accidentally spend on the other chain at the same time. And if you didn't want to do that, you had to buy coins that had been mined on the newer chain or on one of the chains, send it to yourself, then create a transaction where you spend a UTXO from before the fork height and combine it with a UTXO that didn't exist until after the fork height to create a transaction with two inputs, one of which only exists on one fork, and then that transaction is only valid on one chain. That's how you manually do replay protection. You've got little techniques like that probably will be implemented, but then you have the far more serious URSF, which is the response to a UASF, which is them hard forking themselves off of our UASF, the potential chain we could create for them. That's fun. That's never happened before. In my opinion, once a URSF happens, that's the end of soft forks in Bitcoin forever, because they will spontaneously happen in opposition to anything anyone ever tries to do. There is no idea in Bitcoin at this point, with this scale of adoption, that isn't going to have a significant minority oppose the fork, apart from like really obvious stuff. Like there's literally a quantum computer and here is a quantum proof signature algo that we've got to skip to, or we've got to fix the Unix timestamping bug. Those things should be ubiquitous, right? And even them, they'll probably be controversial because some people will want to bundle other stuff with it and some people won't. And you'll have games of chicken where people fork in two different ways. I don't know. I think Bitcoin's easy days of forking are coming to an end. But if someone decides to URSF in this instance and say, we're not risking wipeout, we are going to do our own counterfork to you, then the incumbent chain disappears. You have the UASF chain and then you have the URSF chain, and then both of them will ignore one another from that point onwards. I don't think anyone is going to URSF in order to maintain the ability to store giant op returns and abuse Taproot. I just don't see anyone doing it, because ultimately what's going to end up in that chain is a bunch of the world's most horrible content. I don't know why it wouldn't. What I really hate, and what I will reiterate over and over again, is that it's not going to be me encouraging it. Again, I don't want to be saying I told you so about any of this stuff. I hate the fact that someone put pornography, AI generated or not, of core developers into the Bitcoin blockchain. I hate it. I'm not trying to be right about it. I'm not trying to sit up here and say, I warned you about it, told you so. I don't want that. I don't want the blockchain full of undefensible stuff that goes outside the scope of what a monetary network's supposed to allow. It just undermines Bitcoin. And the saddest part is the Streisand effect is what people keep talking about. The fact that I've raised the alarm about horrible content getting uploaded into the blockchain, and therefore when it does, it's my fault because no one would have thought about it if it wasn't me. In fact, maybe it was even you doing it to prove a point. I hate this because I know people are going to assume that, and I feel like there's going to be an inevitable witch hunt against me and others on my side. And it might even be legitimate. If it genuinely is not supporters uploading porn into their chain, that disgusts me. And I'm going to speak out. People have been telling me, hey, lower the temperature, core devs are getting attacked and stuff like this. And I've said basically nothing about it because I feel like I can't control what it is people do in this space. And I'm looking at it and saying, I can't control this either. I know people are going to vindictively upload horrible content into the non-forked chain or the URSF chain. I wish they wouldn't. I wish people would not make death threats to core developers. I really do. But I can't control any of this stuff. And nothing I say is going to stop people coming after me like it's my fault. And this sucks. It genuinely terrifies me. The fact that when this really contentious fork happens, people are going to start attacking the other chain, filling it up with disgusting, indefensible content that makes them all want to come onto the fork chain. I hate that, but I just don't know how to avoid it. Me sitting up here saying, please don't do it, is just as likely to make people do it anyway. If you're going to invoke the Streisand effect for me bringing it up as a possibility, why can't I invoke the Streisand effect for saying I'm not going to beg them not to attack your chain with this kind of content, because that's going to make them more likely to do it as well. At this point, it's just a case of let's do the proactive version and hope that this stuff never happens and that everyone's just on board with it. So back to the percentage splits. 10%, 90% is a pretty extreme case, but that's enough. If it's 20%, 80%, which is actually the knots to core ratio, assuming those are fairly accurate numbers, they're definitely not reflective of miners, but they are reflective of just basic node runners. If that's the case, I think very quickly prisoner's dilemma comes into effect. The 80% sit there saying, well, if one giant pool with 25% defects to the UASF chain, that's viable. They risk no wipeout. And anything, if we're just hovering above 50% on the non-fork chain, the minute one of us defects, our whole history gets wiped out. So why risk it? What are we even doing this for? So that we can store porn on everyone's computers? I don't think so. I really don't think so. Some of the other FUD would have to be a lot more legitimate. Like, we really need BitVM to happen this year. And even then, find another way to do these interesting things on Bitcoin. Like, we need to limit arbitrary data now. The cat is out of the bag. BSV had already been attacked by this point when it made op returns 100 kilobytes. This is a horrible scenario to be in, and we need to get off quickly. So the other scenario is the reactive case. And this is the one Luke initially was talking about in his draft, which isn't BIP 444, which is a relief to me because, man, this one terrifies me. This is the one where it's something horrible has already made its way into the chain, and we need to retroactively change the rules to make that not a valid block anymore. And we go back and we sit at a block back in history. Maybe we go back 24 hours or something like that, and we sit there waiting for the rest of the network to come and join us and abandon the chain that's building on top of that horrible block. That's the reactive case. We've never done anything like that in Bitcoin before. It's technically totally possible, but man, it just sounds like an absolute disaster. Every 10 minutes, it becomes a harder and harder decision to make, because someone has to abandon every block they've mined on that chain that built on top of that horrible block. Some miners have to abandon that. Some of those miners may have already sold their Bitcoins on exchanges. And, those exchanges are going to be the ones out of pocket. You as a Bitcoiner might have bought Bitcoins off that exchange that now disappear. All of these things can happen. What are the legal ramifications? I have no idea. I don't even know where you'd point the finger for something like that. But suffice to say, if we end up in the reactive scenario, then I would advise people, do not move your UTXOs. Do not consume them. Leave them at an old height, because anything you do after that horrible block gets mined is called into question. History is not going to be written in stone at that point. It's going to be written in Jello. And you're going to want to take everything that happens on the Bitcoin network from that point on with a grain of salt until we reconvene on a blockchain that doesn't have that stuff. Maybe it totally fails. And this is the part where people keep, saying, oh, Ocean's trying to sue people and threaten stuff. Absolutely not. We are saying that the big publicly traded companies that are involved in mining, these huge entities, are probably going to be in a position where their legal department says, we need to go on the fork chain. We can't justify what's going on this right now. That's not me suing someone, okay? So please stop characterizing it as that. It's me living in the real world and saying these guys have legal departments. If Mara have a legal department that said you can't upload copywritten content into the blockchain, but via Slipstream, I assume those same people are going to say to them, there's a fork that doesn't have this pornography in it. You need to go and mine on top of that. And Mara's 5-6% of the network? That's already enough for the prisoner's dilemma thing to kick into effect, and all the other people say, we're mining on top of a potentially dead chain. Let's move, because Foundry's miners are all publicly traded too. I'm sure they're going to be in the same scenario. They can all move over. Now, if you want to say to me, I thought you were in favor of decentralized mining. You want to have 3 or 4 companies decide what the real history of Bitcoin is? Dude, I am here to fix the problem of centralization in mining. But that doesn't mean I need to pretend that mining is decentralized when it isn't, okay? So if the fact that mining is centralized manifests in us being able to pull off the reactive case for this fork, and it signals to the world loudly and clearly that Bitcoin is very, very censorship prone, because this is the mechanism for censorship in Bitcoin. It's just being done against universally abhorrent content that should never have been possible in Bitcoin anyway, based on its format. If that is the thing that signals to the world, hey, we just forked and rewrote history, and we did it by virtue of having super centralized mining, we need to fix that problem now because they can do that for UTXOs too. That to me is going to be very vindicating, because I would be very happy if this fork happens. I would prefer the proactive case, of course. But if the reactive case happens, we get the silver lining of the fact that we just did something horrible in Bitcoin that goes against so many precedents. And on the surface, it's just going to make us all feel sick, but it's better than the alternative. And by the way, we've done all this before. We've rewritten history in Bitcoin before when there have been bugs. And this is essentially the same thing. A bug allowed someone to mine 184 billion Bitcoins. Now a bug allowed someone to mine an 100 kilobyte op return of CSAM. To me, rewriting history, it doesn't even violate precedent. It's just unbelievable and unthinkable to do it at the scale Bitcoin is now. But anyway, we do that. Everyone goes, holy cow, what just happened is unacceptable. Surely these same public entities can implement UTXO blacklists and OFAC comply and all that stuff. We need to fix this problem. And we do that after? and everyone starts using Datum and Ocean and all that stuff, great, I'm going to be really happy. And if people want to make the conspiracy theory that this was Ocean's plan all along to demonstrate that mining is centralized and that Ocean is the answer, that's going to be hilarious to me. But nonetheless, if you want to, I'm just anticipating the conspiracy theory here because it's so going to happen. If people can think in terms of 5D, if people really want to 5D chess this whole thing, Ocean started this whole thing so that they could bring about horrible content in the chain and therefore expose how centralized mining is, fixing that horrible content and thus making everyone get on board the decentralized mining train. Like, I'm telling you, that is a ridiculous thing for people to think. There is no way we've gamed anything out in that regard at all. But poetry being what it is and God having the sense of humor that he does, I can see it all playing out that way. It makes me laugh. And people do like to say the funniest outcome is the most likely. So I can see all that happening. Obviously, this would come off the back of some horrible content. People have made, like, what if it's a picture of Xi Jinping, having something inappropriate done to him sexually, then then Antpool and friends all presumably get called on to do it then, but no one else in the world really cares. Like, it would be, like, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying hopefully it's something less bad like that than it would be straight up CSAM. Because if there's CSAM involved in any of the motivation in what happens here, it's not going to be a laughing matter, sadly. If it happens, I really hope it's AI generated. But I mean, please don't take that as advocacy. I really hate that this is all happening. These are all emergency measures to try and to steady the ship and to steer us away from the rocks that we're headed towards. I'll finish by saying the difference with 2017 is that in 2017, we forked in something we really wanted, which was SegWit, and that gave us Lightning. And that was a really happy thing to do, and we were sold on the benefit. What we're doing here is not quite as compelling. It's a prophylactic measure to prevent bad things happening in Bitcoin and to prevent the slow bleed out of people running nodes or the violent drop in node count that would come as a result of horrible content getting into the blockchain. It's nowhere near as fun, I admit that. But I still think we have a passionate user base that's committed to trying to get Bitcoin back on track. And I'm very, very inspired and encouraged by the amount of support and responsibility Bitcoiners have taken in keeping the network healthy and moving it in the right direction. I'm very inspired by that. And a few months ago, I was pretty depressed about all this. And then I just started seeing how much support there was. And I realized Bitcoiners really will defend this thing, and that's all it really comes down to. Bitcoin does not defend itself. It's only as good as we are, and Bitcoiners still seem pretty good. Our dev class seems complacent at best and utterly corrupt at worst, but we are rooting around the damage they have been doing, and I'm pretty impressed with seeing that. I'm kind of simultaneously relieved and terrified with what's going on at the moment. With regard to a consensus change, because that really is a game of chicken. And it's relieving because this puts a stop to it. We're just done after this. I don't need to rely on a supermajority of nodes adopting knots and having sensible policies and then seeing what miners do with regard to all that. I don't need to worry about that anymore. With consensus, things get fixed in a much more crude and black and white way. Suddenly giant op returns just won't be a thing anymore. So, interesting times. May you invest in uninteresting currencies on uninteresting blockchains. That's certainly not what's going on here, but try and see the joy in it. Try and see the fun. There is definitely a humorous, fun side to all this, and hopefully you can keep your energy up and continue pulling towards what it is Bitcoin's calling us to do to maintain the health of the ecosystem. And let's see how the situation develops. I am monitoring the situation. Thanks for watching, and let's just see how things go from here. Peace.